Hello and welcome to another discussion. Today we're going to be talking about Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. Now, this is a book that's had a profound influence on me and my understanding of the economy that we live in and the current state of society as it is. Hayek hearkened to the times of old when there had been periods of uncertainty, periods of doubt in relation to how we might go about managing the affairs of people. And it seems to me that today the allure of socialism is returning. The idea that planning and control should be in the hands of a few in government positions to determine where the resources of society goes. So in this series I'm going to be reading a few chapters from the words of great thinkers of their time whose ideas extend to our time and that are valid today. And my hope is that we might have a discussion, that we might learn, and that we might find a better way forward with inspiration from the past that might help us to make better decisions moving forward. So with that, I'll begin by reading The Road to Serfdom. The chapter I want to read is called Background to Danger. Individualism, in contrast to socialism and all other forms of totalitarianism, is based on the respect of Christianity for the individual man and the belief that it is desirable that men should be free to develop their own individual gifts and bents. This philosophy, first fully developed during the Renaissance, grew and spread into what we now know as Western civilization. The general direction of social development was one of freeing the individual from the ties which bound him in feudal society. Perhaps the greatest result of this unchaining of individual energies was the marvelous growth of science. Only since industrial freedom opened the path to the free use of new knowledge, only since everything could be tried, if somebody could be found to back at its own risk, has science made the great strides which it in the last 150 years have changed the face of the world. The result of this growth surpassed all expectations. Wherever the barriers to free exercise of human ingenuity were removed, man became rapidly able to satisfy ever-widening ranges of desire. By the beginning of the 20th century, the working man in the Western world had reached a degree of material comfort, security, and personal independence, which 100 years before had hardly seemed possible. The effect of this success was to create among men a new sense of power over their fate, the belief in the unbounded possibilities of improving their own lot. What had been achieved came to be regarded as a secure and imperishable possession, acquired once and for all, and the rate of progress began to seem too slow. Moreover, the principles which had made this progress possible came to be regarded as obstacles to speedier progress, impatiently to be brushed away. It might be said that the very success of liberalism became the cause of its decline. No sensible person should have doubted that the economic principles of the 19th century were only a beginning, that there were immense possibilities of advancement on the lines on which we had moved. But according to the views now dominant, the question is no longer how we can make the best use of the spontaneous forces found in a free society. We have in effect undertaken to dispense with these forces and to replace them by collective and conscious direction. It is significant that this abandonment of liberalism, whether expressed as socialism in its more radical form, or merely as organization or planning, was perfected in Germany. During the last quarter of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th, Germany moved far ahead in both the theory and the practice of socialism, so that even today Russian discussion largely carries on where the Germans left off. The Germans, long before the Nazis, were attacking liberalism and democracy, capitalism and individualism. Long before the Nazis, too, the German and Italian socialists were using techniques of which the Nazis and fascists later made effective use. The idea of a political party which embraces all activities of the individual from the cradle to the grave, which claims to guide his views on everything, was first put into practice by the socialists. It was not the fascists but the socialists who began to collect children at their tenderest age into political organizations to direct their thinking. It was not the fascists but the socialists who first thought of organizing sports in games, football and hiking, in party clubs where the members would not be affected by other views. It was the socialists who first insisted that the party member should distinguish himself from others by modes of greeting and the forms of address. It was they who, by their organization of cells and devices for the permanent supervision of private life, created the prototype of the totalitarian party. By the time Hitler came to power, liberalism was dead in Germany, and it was socialism that had killed it. Too many who have watched the transition from socialism to fascism at close quarters, the connection between the two systems has become increasingly obvious. But in the democracies, the majority of people still believe that socialism and freedom can be combined. They do not realize that democratic socialism, the great utopia of the last few generations, is not only unachievable, but that to strive for it produces something utterly different, the very destruction of freedom itself. As has been aptly said, what has always made the state a hell on earth has been precisely that man has tried to make it his heaven. It is disquieting to see in England and in the United States today the same drawing together of forces and nearly the same contempt of all that is liberal in the old sense. Conservative socialism was a slogan under which a large number of writers prepared the atmosphere in which the National Socialism succeeded. It is conservative socialism which is the dominant trend among us now. The liberal way of planning. Planning owes its popularity largely to the fact that everybody desires, of course, that we should handle our common problems with as much foresight as possible. The dispute between the modern planners and the liberals is not on whether we ought to employ systematic thinking in planning our affairs. It is a dispute about what is the best way of doing so. The question is whether we should create conditions under which the knowledge and initiative of individuals are given the best scope so that they can plan most successfully, or whether we should direct and organize all economic activities according to a blueprint, that is, consciously direct the resources of society to conform to the planner's particular views of who should have what. It is important not to confuse opposition against the latter kind of planning with a dogmatic laissez-faire attitude. The liberal argument does not advocate leaving things just as they are. It favors making the best possible use of the forces of competition as a means of coordinating human efforts. It is based on the conviction that where effective competition can be created, it is a better way of guiding individuals' efforts than any other. It emphasizes that in order to make competition work beneficially, a carefully thought out legal framework is required, and that neither the past nor the existing legal rules are free from grave defects. Liberalism is opposed, however, to supplanting competition by inferior methods of guiding economic activity, and it regards competition as superior not only because in most circumstances it is the most efficient method known, but because it is the only method which does not require the coercive or arbitrary intervention of authority. It dispenses with the need for conscious social control and gives individuals a chance to decide whether the prospects of a particular occupation are sufficient to compensate for the disadvantages connected with it. The successful use of competition does not preclude some types of government interference, for instance, to limit working hours, to require certain sanitary arrangements, to provide an extensive system of social services is fully compatible with the preservation of competition. There are, too, certain fields where the system of competition is impracticable. For example, the harmful effects of deforestation or the smoke of factories cannot be confined to the owner of the property in question. But the fact that we have to resort to a direct regulation by authority, where the condition for the proper working of competition cannot be created, does not prove that we should suppress competition where it can be made to function. To create conditions in which competition will be as effective as possible, to prevent fraud and deception, to break up monopolies, these tasks provide a wide and unquestioned field for state activity. This does not mean that it is possible to find some middle way between competition and central direction. though nothing seems at first more plausible or is more likely to appeal to reasonable people. Mere common sense proves a treacherous guide in this field. Although competition can bear some mixture of regulation, it cannot be combined with planning to any extent we like without ceasing to operate as an effective guide to production. Both competition and central direction become poor and inefficient tools if they are incomplete, and a mixture of the two means that neither will work. Planning and competition can be combined only by planning for competition, not by planning against competition. The planning against which all our criticism is directed is solely the planning against competition. The Great Utopia. There can be no doubt that most of those in the democracies who demand a central direction of all economic activity still believe that socialism and individual freedom can be combined. Yet socialism was early recognized by many thinkers as the gravest threat to freedom. It is rarely remembered now that socialism in its beginnings was frankly authoritarian. It began quite openly as a reaction against the liberalism of the French Revolution. The French writers who laid its foundation had no doubt that their ideas could be put into practice only by a strong dictatorial government. The first of modern planners, Saint Simon, predicted that those who did not obey his proposed planning boards would be treated as cattle. Nobody saw more clearly than the great political thinker de Tocqueville that democracy stands in an irreconcilable conflict with socialism. Democracy extends the sphere of an individual freedom, he said. Democracy attaches all possible value to each man, he said in 1948, while socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. Democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word: equality. But notice the difference. While democracy seeks equality in liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. To allay these suspicions and to harness to its cart the strongest of all political motives, the craving for freedom, socialists began increasingly to make use of the promise of a new freedom. Socialism was to bring economic freedom, without which political freedom was not worth having. To allay these suspicions and to harness to its cart the strongest of all political motives, the craving for freedom, socialists began increasingly to make use of the promise of a new freedom. Socialism was to bring economic freedom, without which political freedom was not worth having. To make this argument sound plausible, the word freedom was subjected to a subtle change in meaning. The word had formerly meant freedom from coercion, from the arbitrary power of other men. Now it was made to mean freedom from necessity, release from the compulsion of the circumstances which inevitably limit the range of choice of all of us. Freedom in this sense is, of course, merely another name for power or wealth. The demand for the new freedom was thus only another name for the old demand for a redistribution of wealth. The claim that a planned economy would produce a substantially larger output than the competitive system is being progressively abandoned by most students of the problem. Yet it is this false hope, as much as anything, which drives us along the road to planning. Although our modern socialists promise a greater freedom, it is genuine and sincere. In recent years, observer after observer has been impressed by the unforeseen consequences of socialism, the extraordinary similarity in many respects of the conditions under communism and fascism. As the writer Friedrich expressed in 1939, the complete collapse of the belief in the attainability of freedom and equality through Marxism has forced Russia to travel the same road towards a totalitarian society of unfreedom and inequality which Germany has been following. Not that communism and fascism are essentially the same. Fascism is the stage reached after communism has proved an illusion, and it has proved as much an illusion in Russia as in pre-Hitler Germany. No less significant is the intellectual outlook of the rank and file in the communist and fascist movements in Germany before 1933. The relative ease with which a young communist could be converted into a Nazi or vice versa was well known. Best of all to the propagandists of the two parties. The communists and Nazis clashed more frequently with each other than with other parties, simply because they competed for the same type of mind and reserved for each other the hatred of the rhetoric. of the heretic. Their practice showed how closely they are related to both the real enemy. The man with whom they had nothing in common was the liberal of the old type, while to the Nazi, the communist, and to the communist, the Nazi, and to both the socialists are potential recruits made of the right timber. They both know that there can be no compromise between them, and those who really believe in individual freedom. What is promised to us as the road to freedom is, in fact, the high road to servitude, for it is not difficult to see what must be the consequences when democracy embarks upon a course of planning. The goal of planning will be described by some such vague term as the general welfare. There will be no real agreement as to the ends to be attained, and the effect of people's agreeing that there must be central planning, without agreeing on the ends, will be rather as if a group of people were to commit themselves to take a journey together without agreeing where they want to go, with the result that they may all have to make a journey which most of them do not want at all. Democratic assemblies cannot function as planning agencies. They cannot produce agreement on everything. The whole direction of the resources of the nation, for the number of possible courses of action, will be legion. Even if the Congress could, by proceeding step by step and compromising at each point, agree on some scheme, it would certainly end in the end satisfy nobody. To draw up an economic plan in this fashion is even less possible than, for instance, successfully to plan a military campaign by democratic procedure. As in strategy, it would become inevitable to delegate the task to experts. And even if, by this expedient, a democracy should succeed in planning every sector of economic activity, it would still have to face the problem of integrating these separate plans into a unitary whole. There will be a stronger and stronger demand that some board or some single individual should be given powers to act on their own responsibility. The cry for an economic dictator is a characteristic stage in the movement toward planning. Thus, the legislative body will be reduced to choosing the persons who are to have practically absolute power. The whole system will tend towards that kind of dictatorship, in which the head of government is from time to time confirmed in his position by popular vote, but where he has all the power at his command to make certain that the vote will go in the direction that he desires. Planning leads to dictatorship because dictatorship is the most effective instrument of coercion, and as such essential if central planning on a large scale is to be possible. There is no justification for the widespread belief that, so long as power is conferred by democratic procedure, it cannot be arbitrary. It is not the source of power which prevents it from being arbitrary, to be free from the dictatorial qualities. The power must also be limited. A true dictatorship of the proletariat, even if democratic in form, if it undertook centrally to direct the economic system, would probably destroy personal freedom as completely as any autocracy has ever done. Individual freedom cannot be reconciled with the supremacy of one single purpose to which the whole society is permanently subordinated. To a limited extent, we ourselves experience this fact in wartime, when subordination of almost everything to the immediate and pressing need is the price at which we preserve our freedom in the long run. The fashionable phrases about doing for the purpose of peace what we have learned to do for the purposes of war are completely misleading. For it is sensible, temporarily, to sacrifice freedom in order to make it more secure in the future. But it is quite a different thing to sacrifice liberty permanently in the interests of a planned economy. To those who have watched the transition from socialism to fascism at close quarters, the connection between the two systems is obvious. The realization of the socialist program means the destruction of freedom. Democratic socialism, the great utopia of the last few generations, is simply not achievable. That was a reading from The Road to Serfdom. I highly recommend reading the book. It's a book that has inspired me to think differently about how I look at the economy, about how I look at the choices people make in relation to how they organize themselves and how they engage in public life and in the economy. As you read books like this, you begin to see parallels between how society is moving and the shift that it's taking, the direction that we are going in. the game we are playing now, in my view, is a game of managing the success that we have had. Hayek even mentions that the undoing of the liberal order is partly due to the success that it has in generating a surplus of food and generating opportunities for people. And there's no better system that we know of that's able to do that than the one that we enjoy now. So the challenge for us is to preserve these freedoms, to preserve the system as it is, to change what we need to change to make sure that it is effective and that it works. And these are all things that everyday people can get engaged in. Everyday people can get educated on these things. This book, for example, The Road to Serfdom, is inexpensive, and it's full of ideas that are empowering, that champion freedom and liberty of the individual. And these are the ideas that need to come back to the surface of society. The ideas of the importance of freedom. The ideas on the importance of liberty. So check it out and let's have a discussion. Leave comments if you would like, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have or have a discussion about this book. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.